All right, everyone, thank you very much for joining us for today's TNT seminar. For those who haven't come before, TNT is the Translational Neuroengineering um, Technologies Network. And we're a group here at Hopkins that is geared towards, run by grad students and geared towards anyone at Hopkins who is interested in neuroengineering technologies. And so we put on events like what we have today, a seminar, we have journal clubs, social events like happy hours, and professional development events as well. So if you are interested in coming to our events, please go to our website, which I'll post in the chat, and add yourself on our mailing list so you can hear about our events that we have, typically 1 to 2 a month. So our next event actually will be a journal club next Thursday, where we'll be talking about high density, an example of a high density tactile sensing system that's pretty cool. So we'd love to have you guys join us for that as well. For today's seminar talk, if you have any questions, you are welcome to jump in at any time. If you want to send questions in the chat or just jump in on the audio, just feel free to interrupt and ask questions as you like. And of course, questions at the end are also welcome. Another final thing, I'll be sending out a poll near the end of the talk to find out who's here and kind of gauge your interest about TNT. So please make sure to fill that out before you go. And with that, we'll get started. So today we have Paul Marasco presenting. I've heard him speak a couple times, so he's very interesting and easy to talk to. So I'm really excited to have him here. He's an associate professor at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner Research Institute in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, and he's going to talk about prosthetic kinesthesia, as you can see on the title slide. So should be really interesting, and very happy to have him. And with that, Paul, you can take over.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Mark. And actually, it's really great to be able to talk to everybody. I was out at J2, I don't know, what was it, like 3 years ago?
Yeah, about 3 years, yeah.
Yeah, so did a blast through and had some fun hanging out. And then I hope to be back one of these days, actually in person, but the virtual thing is actually kind of easy to do. So I guess, really, when you guys asked me to come out, it was like having this conversation about sort of unsolved problems in neural engineering. And I had some, I was like, oh my goodness gracious, how am I going to tackle this? And then I realized that we actually have a really cool unsolved problem, or I don't want to say had, but it's an unsolved problem that's been a thing for a lot of years. And so I thought it would actually, I set the talk up really kind of to walk you guys through the process, right? Like actually show you sort of how things started out, where we were at, what we were thinking, places that took us that we were unexpected. And I've thrown in, some dates so you kind of get to see the timeline. And the other thing that was really fun was I actually got to dig in on kind of like some serious history of like stuff that we've been doing in the lab. And so I was pulling out PowerPoints from 10 years ago and digging through videos and stuff like that. And so it's actually been a lot of fun kind of doing the archaeology. And then the ironic thing about that, it's like the first slide itself starts pretty much with archaeology. And you guys have to pardon me. There we go. And I'm assuming everybody can hear me. Mark and I were talking. My audio is not so awesome. So hopefully this is going to work. All right. So prosthetics, they've been around for a long time, right? So this mummy foot over here on the left, that's a functional weight-bearing prosthesis. It actually has a socket. It was worn for many, many years out in Switzerland, or the group that took a look at that, like reevaluated this thing, realized that this is an actual weight-bearing socket and prosthetic toe that did a job and that had been modified through the course of the user's life. And so this is 3,000 years ago. This is like 16th dynasty of Egypt. And an interesting thing about this, is that prosthetic limbs, and I'll just throw in a fun fact that just popped up just the other day, actually. So paper just came out in Nature, I think just a few weeks ago, or possibly September. I'm not sure where it was exactly, but they have evidence of the oldest surgical amputation of a limb at 31,000 years ago. It was found in a cave in Borneo. So like we've been taking arms and legs, or presumably legs, off for a long time. My wife jokes, she's like, well, chances are they've been doing that a little bit before 31,000 years if they were actually good enough to get it to work, because it's got healing and everything. But the deal with this, the reason I talk about this is like amputation, prosthetics, all of these things have been with us for a long time. And one of these, like the unsolved problem with prosthetic limbs is prosthetics don't have proprioception, right? You always have to watch them. You have to feel, you have to look and see what they're doing. And when I say they've been around for a long time, like, and it's interesting because the Dorrance hook, which was patented in 1912, like that thing is pretty much a Bowden cable system. It's a body powered hook. You shrug your shoulders to open and close it. Prosthetic arms came kind of sort of matured during the Civil War and then hit their zenith in World War II. And then we haven't really adjusted after that. Like we still use the same Nordic style hook for all intents and purposes now. And an interesting thing about that is one of the reasons that these body powered hooks continue to persist is because they have an intrinsic sense of proprioception in them, because you can intuitively feel the excursion of the hook through the cable system. And so ironically, like one of the oldest functional prosthetics that we have actually has a certain degree of proprioception. And, we talk about in the neural machine interface world, we're like, hey, we want to duplicate the function of the hand. We want to get all these advanced mechatronics and do all this stuff. But our pretty little secret is that we actually can't even keep pace with it. We can't even build a device that can keep up with a body powered hook, right? And it's that intrinsic sensation of movement that this thing provides that is likely the basis for its functionality. That, and it's cheap and it's easy and intuitive to use. And we could talk about some of the other problems with it, which are multitude. And that's like a whole different conversation that we can have with some of the work that we've done. But that's kind of our lead in this whole question of proprioception, right? So the deal is, people with amputation, they just simply can't feel their limbs, right? And since this was kind of an archaeological expedition for me too, I actually kept my old slide that I used to have in here. And the new slide that I'm showing you is some really beautiful work done by our colleagues at the University of Alberta. And the two videos are showing you the difference between the way an able-bodied person does a task, and they're picking things up and moving. What we do is we're tracking, like we're using 3D gaze vectoring to see where their eyes are looking. And if you look at the individual, an intact or able-bodied individual, their eyes dart forward into the task, right? They're never watching their hands. They're always looking into the next thing. So, they want to grab a thing, they look at it, they grab it, and then their eyes turn and look to the next thing while they're still doing the task. Now, look at that. Like, if you look at somebody with a prosthesis, and this is a really, really highly functional user. And you'll notice that as soon as Rob reaches down and grabs the cup, his eyes snap to that cup and they don't leave. And he quickly jogs across to make sure he's going to end up where he wants to be, but his eyes never leave the prosthesis. And that right there is the killer, right? That you can't multitask, you can't do other things, you can't be thinking. And then you're using a modality, which is vision, that isn't really, not really optimized to help you move neurons. That was never how that's never how the system uses that information. It uses it it compensates, but it doesn't use it that way. So I'm jumping around a little bit, right? So that kind of breaks down the actual problem itself. And let me just give you a quick overview of what we do. And the neural machine interface system that we work in is targeted regeneration. And so people have had their nerves redirected to new muscle and skin sites. And we essentially, after an amputation, all the nerves are sitting there, we take them out, and then we surgically redirect them to like biceps, triceps, pectoralis. And now when the individual thinks, hey, I want to close my hand, instead of their missing hand closing, instead of, the nerves don't go anywhere. Now that they're in the new muscle, and they think I want to close my hand, little bits of the muscle twitch. right? And when the muscle twitches, we can read that with an electromyographic electrode, and we can say, oh, hey, they need to close their hand. And so what happens is we essentially surgically reassign the functionality of the muscle to make it equate to the intuitive functions of the hand. So they can control multiple degrees of freedom with their prosthetic limb simultaneously. They open their hand, they close their hand, they do all these things, and it's intuitive and natural. The other piece of this that we work in is targeted sensory reinnervation, which is, during the process of the reinnervation for muscle, we can also denervate the skin, and then the reinnervating afferents find the skin we essentially set the skin up as a receptive target environment, and then the sensory nerves go out into the skin and then reestablish a sense of touch out on the skin of the missing hand, right? So now when you touch them at different places on their reinnervated skin, they feel that like it's actually part of their hand. And it's not phantom sensation, it's actually their sensations. And what we've done is we've taken the nerves that used to go to the hand and we just put them into a new place. And then they reinnervate the terminal end receptors. And so we get nice, clean reinnervation across multiple modalities. And we use different effects of that to tap into different channels. We also do some other stuff, and since it's kind of since I'm going to be talking about proprioception, I'll save the proprioceptive stuff till the end, or till we get a little bit further in. But what we end up with is essentially what we do is we kind of recapitulate the neural control and feedback architecture, right? And so the brain interprets all of this sensation like as the real hand, as the real actions, and because they are, right? And we've got a really neat video in the lab that shows just like how this happens. And I think you guys see my cursor? Okay. Yeah, so
Yes.
the thing to remember, so this is Claudia, she's one of our participants, and Claudia this is her reinnervated chest over here. So there's little robots that touch on her chest every time we touch one of the fingers. The fingers are really sensitive. She's got sensation on her thumb and all the digits, and then the palm. And so when you touch the different parts of this hand, that information is transferred up to a robotic system that then pushes on the individual portions of the reinnervated skin equating to the fingers. And so the neat thing about this is I'm bored, she's bored, we're kind of sitting there, and I'm going to touch her hand, and what you're going to see is actually triggering the visual orientation reflex. And so you've got structures in your brain. It's a spirit calculus. It has a body map of state. It has a body map. It has a map of your body and a map of visual space, right? And so when somebody taps you on the shoulder and you turn, like if they tap you on the shoulder, you turn and look at that, it's the superior calculus that mediates that interaction. And so what's neat about this is that Claudia's hands, she's metal, steel, plastic, copper, silicone, all that stuff from here to here, right? And what you're going to see is we're both bored, we're sitting there, I touch your fingertips, and watch where she looks. So she turns, and the superior calculus says, look at your hand, right? So she actually looks at the fingertip of the prosthesis, only feeling the sensation up here. And so this is an innate remap. It's not even a remapping, it's a recapitulation of the representational architecture, right? So everything matches up very nicely, everything fits. And this is kind of that innate work. That's going to be a theme through the rest of the talk. All right, so now we'll start getting into the movement sensation stuff. So, I don't know, 2011, 2012, 2013, started having some ideas, about like how can this, was really curious about proprioception, because proprioception, for all intents and purposes, is like the holy grail for prosthetic. Not easy to get to. Nobody's been terribly successful at it. And, it's like, hey, look, if you can separate yourself from having to watch the prosthesis, that's a huge thing. And so, I was doing some experiments in animals, trying to get a sense of how proprioception was working. We had some really cool preps I was working at the Rehabilitation Institute in Chicago, where all these surgeries were taking place. We had some cool plastic surgeons doing neat surgeries. And so we were experimenting, doing some interesting stuff with that to learn more about proprioception. And then at the same time, we're also, since we've got a sense of touch, we were using touch as a way to sort of tap into ownership of the prosthesis embodiment, to actually get them not only from a reflexive perspective to get the arms to be perceived as part of, or to function as part of them, but then also to get their brains to perceive that the limb is a part of their body. And that's like a whole different talk all on its own that we do, that we can do, but not for today. So the touch stuff, we usually mostly use the cognitive engagement. But it's really, what we really do is when they provided the touch, their brain says, oh, hey, I feel the touch in the right place. I see it in the right place. Therefore, this limb belongs to my, incorporated into my self-image. But the cool thing about it is that it's an illusion. It's a cognitive illusion that you can create, and it's the flip side of the rubber hand illusion that everyone's familiar with. And so we're kind of getting a sense of how kinesthesias work and how proprioceptions work, and we're working in these illusions and these cognitive illusions, and we're stumbling across this thing called the kinesthetic illusion. Right? It's like, you know, and the thought process is really pretty simple. Right? I'm a pretty blunt instrument. I don't have a lot going on. And I was like, hey, we've got an illusion that gives you a sense of movement, right? We've got people that have got a sense of touch, and we've got people that have got a sense of different things. And we really like these illusions because an illusion is an illusion because it overrides reality. And so it's a really powerful tool to tap the system with. And so the kinesthetic illusion is, you know, if you vibrate the limb, you vibrate somebody's muscle, you vibrate a bicep, you get this, if you do that between 70 and 114 hertz, you get the joint specific sense that the arms move, right? And there's been a lot of really interesting work on this over the years about, you know, how you actually perceive that information, what you can do with it. You can recapitulate some interesting hand movements and stuff like that. But from my perspective, I was like, hey, look, we can get a joint specific sense that the limb is moving, and maybe we could use that in a TMR system, you know, and see if we can get, you know, joint specific sense of movement in TMR, right? And that really was the hypothesis when we started out with this. So we did it, we wrote up a grant, put that together, pitched it to the NIH, and we did it on a kind of a cool grant. We did it in an NIH Director's Transformative ROI. And we just said, hey, look, we've got some data saying we can get it that proprioception is kind of recapitulated in some of the rodents that we work with. And we think that we might be able, if we can get like a figure or something, you know, we might be able to equate that or map that to a prosthesis. And we, you know, we put the project together, the NIH said, yeah, let's do it. Well, let's go for it. And so since it's one of these high risk grants, we didn't have a lot to go on, right? We were like, okay, there's not a lot of preliminary data on this. This is what we're thinking we can do. And what we did is started getting going on the project, and we brought Claudia in. And this was 2013, maybe 2012. And it was a project with me and then my colleague Jacqueline Hebert at University of Alberta. She's the one who did those two videos at the beginning. And so this was a really cool thing. So Claudia comes into the lab, and Claudia was here in Cleveland working with another group, and we didn't tell her what we were up to, right? So she came in working with this other group. We said, hey, can we get a couple of hours with you while you're here in town? She said, yeah, sure. So we sat down in my lab, and the group that she was working with was asking her questions about touch. Right? And they were like touching her, doing different stuff with her renovated skin. And we didn't really tell her what we were up to. Right? So we got our vibration system out. This thing vibrates at 90 hertz. And there's a little backstory to the 90 hertz stuff, but that's probably too much for today. But so we're vibrating our muscle at 90 hertz, and this is a reinnervated muscle on our skin. So we're touching her different places, and we're vibrating, and we're telling her, you know, we say, well, what do you feel? And the neat thing about it is she's reporting what she was reporting to the other group, right? She's like, oh, I feel tingly in my fingers, or I feel this, I feel that. Like this is kind of like a buzzy sensation, and she's reporting tactile percepts back to us. And we're like, okay, that's really good. That's nice to know. And so we're writing stuff down beautifully, and then we hit a spot on her chest, and we buzz her, and she was like, oh, that was weird. And we're like, what was weird? And she's like, well, I felt my finger move. And we were like, oh yeah, that's weird. And then she turned around, you know, and we're like, oh man, you know, is it really? And so, you know, so she turns back in, and we're like back to straight face, and we're like, yeah, let's go ahead and keep going. So we marked that spot, and then we're trying different places. And then we came back to that spot again, and we buzzed it again, and she was like, "Oh, well, that was, there it is again." And we're like, "Well, you keep saying this thing. What is this?" And she's like, "Well, when you buzz me, I feel like my fingers closing." Like, oh yeah, right. And so we finished, got a couple of things from her, and then wrapped it up. And then I was immediately on the phone. I was texting my Jacqueline up in Alberta, and I'm like, "Holy crap, we got this!" And so she had targeted innovation amputees with targeted sensory innovation up there in Alberta. And she started doing it. And at the same time, we started bringing people in and started doing it as well. And so what happened next was really interesting. So this thing totally blew up, right? Like when we first did Claudia, right, we had a finger. Well, I'm like, okay, maybe I can map that to the gap of a prosthetic limb, or to a myoelectric hand. I can work with that. If I get a thumb or a finger, I can work with that. Well, that's not what happened. When we started actually pumping people through, and we did 10 to 13 individuals. This was a really cool thing. We were doing groups of individuals in the US. We were doing groups in Canada. We had 2 sites in Canada. We were also working with John Simpson at the University of New Brunswick. So John had his population, Jacqueline had her population, I had my population. And what happened was really cool because everybody we worked with showed the same process. Right. So now suddenly what we're doing is we've got 3 independent experiments running across an international border, and everybody shows cylinder grip, right? Everybody shows fine pinch. Everybody shows tripod grip. Everybody's showing all of these really interesting things. And the thing that was crazy about it is this wasn't just a finger, right? These are highly synergistic, these are highly complex synergistic grip concepts. They're like, you turn this on, they're like, my whole hand is closing down into a fist. Or I'm closing down into a tripod grip, right? Or my thumb's closing across the palm of my hand. And then, we could get individual, we could get hand open, we could get hand closed. And a lot of really interesting things happen because this is, so what was fascinating is, I assume there's probably a bunch of motor control people on the call today. And from the perspective of motor control of complex synergies, right, we've got an infinite dimensionality problem, right? And one of the ways that people hypothesize that you deal with the infinite dimensionality, because you could do any number of different movements that you probably never felt before. It's probably built from a system of primitives or engrams, essentially building blocks, right, that let you sort of construct a motor plan based on some of its fundamental characteristics. And what was interesting to us is there's this whole question of infinite dimensionality and synergies in the motor control literature, the motor control science. And it turns out that the sensation of motor control likely follows that same infinite dimensionality problem. And what we opened up was essentially a list, a catalog of highly behaviorally relevant synergies. Right, so we buzz them in a particular place, and you get cylinder grip, right? You get fine pitch, you get tripod grip. These are all fundamental grips that presumably are being used as primitives to build out the more complex sensation. So that was another. So we actually think that there's a possibility this kind of provides us a window into the actual sensation of kinesthesia, particularly with respect to hand synergy. So that was a neat thing. The cool thing about it from the perspective of a prosthetic limb was we actually had to go out and we had to go buy a mechatronic hand that could actually do all the synergies that we could actually generate with kinesthesia, right? So we had to use a touch bionics limb that could actually physically do all of the individual things. And we mapped that to the function of a prosthesis. And so what we do now is you can see here, this is right over here. This is the vibration element that's plugged into her reinnervated muscle. We vibrate that at 90 hertz. What she feels is her hand closing down into a fist. And so what we do is we have her show us what the illusion looks like, and then we program the hand to close at the same time the illusion closes. And now what we're going to see here is this is Amanda. She's one of our participants. She's actively controlling her hand. So she's thinking, I'm going to close my hand into a fist. So we've got hand close set up for her with her TMR. And then when the hand closes, the hand sends the signal to the vibration element that says, okay, this is the sensation that you're going to feel, the hand closing down with the fist. And then she's going to actually tell us what she's feeling with her right hand. And the neat thing about this is that she can't feel it, she can't feel it, she can't see it, she can't engage with the limb at all. She's pretty much blind to the whole thing. And she's going to tell us what she's feeling. So I'll start there.
Close.
So the idea,
Okay,
we did our
close.
job right. What the hand
Okay,
does,
go ahead and open it up.
Close. Could be closed.
Okay, go ahead and open it up.
I'll stop that. All right, so what we did when we actually, so the idea was, okay, hey, now we can actually tell somebody what their hand's physically doing in space, and they can't see it, they can do all this different stuff. And so what did we see? One of the things we saw was that it was robust and repeatable, right? We could do this over, it was nice and clean, the illusion moved through a set speed, the illusion had a specific speed that it went. We could program the hand to get to that. It was pretty easy to be able to say, hey, look, when you start, you end the hand and your hand. The prosthesis and your illusion and the hand, they all work together. We actually showed that they developed a sense of agency, which is a whole nother can of worms that I won't go into today because that gets pretty complex. And that's like the subject of an entirely different talk. But the idea is that we could give them a sense that they were the actual the author of the actions that they were engaged in. It's the subcomponent to it's a subcomponent to limb ownership, right? There's ownership and agency. Ownership is touch, agency is really kinesthesia, and then the two things together are actually embodiment, like a fully embodied limb that you own, and you have the one that gives sense belongs to you, and two gives you the sense that you're actually the person controlling it. And I've got a little video I'll show you guys where one of our participants breaks that very complex difference between the self-referential I am system down beautifully without actually knowing that he's talking about it in an amazing way. So, and then the cool thing was, you know, one of the criticisms that we got on that paper, one of the criticisms that we got when we were doing that stuff was, and it's funny, actually, I'll go back a couple of slides, but was like, you know, look, it's too slow, right? The illusion doesn't move fast enough. And it turns out that depending on what we show them and how we actually we can get into that system and then we can actually update it, right? So we can actually make the brain perceive that the hand is moving faster by showing it the proper imagery. And so we could actually even modulate, change the way that the illusion was perceived. And the cool thing was that it didn't have a washout. And I put this in and forgot to mention it, right? So when we did all this stuff with Claudia the first time, this was back 2013. When I was going through my old slides, I found this, like, it was under review, right? In 2016, this was under review at Nature. Like, we actually got through editorial review in Nature. And we had this in like 2014, 2015, and the reviewers were like, yeah, no, it's not review, right? And they tanked it. And then the interesting thing about it was all the work that we had done in there. And this is the reason I'm saying this is just to give you guys some insight into the process. So this was an NIH director's transformative R01. This was not a small nor a throwaway grant, right? Like this was a high impact, this was a high risk, high reward grant. We put everything in the entire grant that we had proposed in the grant that we were successfully awarded into one paper. We sent that into Nature. It got through editorial review, because if you get through editorial review, if you get it through editorial review, you've got a 90% chance of getting through to your final review. It's the editorial review that actually prevents you from moving forward. We got through editorial review, and the reviewers were like, yeah, not interested. And I was just completely floored. And so we had to actually redo from scratch the entire project. Right. And so now this is actually us doing 2 more years of work on top of everything that we did. And the interesting thing is this one figure out of a paper that was in Science Translational Medicine. Yeah, there we go. So this all landed in Science Translational Medicine. The only figure that was in the original paper that we sent in is this one here. And the whole thing had to be completely redone from an entirely different standpoint. We didn't even do anything that we said that we were going to do in the grant. It had to be above and beyond. So not that I'm salty about any of that. So, but you know, it's that kind of just like, you know, sometimes you just don't know where things are going to go, right? You just have to keep pounding on it, keep doing it until you get through it. So to deal with that, so let's see here, where am I at? So they get a sense of agency, it's robust, it's repeatable, we can update it. And, you know, we talk about hacking into the perceptual integration system, and that's essentially what we do at the Illusion. We go and tap the system, and then we provide input into the system. And I use the system, we're actually providing input into essentially the operating system, the brain's operating system versus the GUI, which is the self-referential art. So we talk to the system. And that's kind of a sea change that I'll talk about as we were going through. Yeah, so one of the interesting things for us as we were going along this is, you know, we found this stuff, we found some really interesting things. And then we ran into a really interesting thing where we started getting able-bodied levels of function out of people, right? So we ran this thing that's a grip repositioning task, and essentially all they have to do is we just say, hey, we show them a picture, close your hand to 25%, 50%, 75, or 100% close, right? And then they use the neural machine interface to close the hand, they get feedback from it. But the deal is that it all runs in a virtual environment, and they can't feel or see the hand. So they just have to do it through what they're feeling. And we found that they proportionally, they get right on, right? They do a great job. Turns out that when they don't have the system on, they don't really know what's going on. One guy in particular, who I'll talk about in a second, has no idea what's going on with his hand. But as soon as we give them the sensation, they all coalesce down here into this really highly, they're really good at getting their hand at the right place in the right time in a very short amount of time. They're doing this in 0.2 of a second. And the conversation in the lab was like, wow, they're really good at this, right? So we said, well, you know, somebody, one of the guys mentioned, like, so presumably they're doing this as well as an able-bodied, right? And we're like, well, you know, we've got able-bodies around, so let's throw some able-bodies at it. So we ran a cohort of able-bodies, and then we gave the able-bodied the same task. We said, we just restricted them to a 1 degree of freedom task, which is where the myoelectric happens. And then we said, well, close your fingers down to 50% or 75% or 100%. And the interesting thing with the people with the able-bodied people is that 100%, they could actually feel when they were closed because they could feel their fingers touch. And lo and behold, this is the average for the able-bodied population, right? And it turns out that our neural machine interface population is actually a tiny bit better. Like, this is 2 standard deviations away from below the average, right? And so that was a really interesting thing. They could also track better. They could follow when they have the kinesthesia. We actually ran it in a bidirectional, or we had it in a bidirectional system with a 2-site control, so they could feel when their hand open, and they could also feel their hand closed, and they track better. But the deal with this was, and I'm just going to show you, Rob is one of our guys, hated what we were doing, right? Rob's like, this is crap. He's like, I know what my hand's doing. I know exactly how this is working. It's like, this buzz thing that you guys are doing, I'm not liking it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. You're overdriving my hand. You're doing all these different things. Well, this is Rob. So what Rob thought when he's like, I know exactly where my hand is. Well, Rob's data, when Rob doesn't have his feedback system on, Rob has no idea where his hand is. He's terrible at the he's like atrocious at this task. This is Amanda, she's a really good user. And then this is another guy that we had from Canada who's also a really good user. And then we give everybody a little bit of feedback, which is like 20 hertz, so that they can actually get a sense of when the motor's going. But it's a control because it's not generating illusion. They do get better, right? They're really good at using every little piece of information. But then you give them a 90 hertz and they're all boom, right together, and they're all really good at this task. Well, this is Rob describing this, and this is
Because when it vibrates, it disrupts what I feel. So I don't really know if I'm at 25 or 50% because it starts to vibrate on me. Does it feel the same uniform?
How about, are you able to, you actuate it?
Oh, you want me to?
That's how I,
Okay.
because when you do it, then I just let however it feel. When I'm doing it, I'm not paying attention to it.
So Rob and a couple of different pieces of this, right? The big one, the important one being this.
Because when it vibrates, it disrupts what I feel.
So Rob's like, when you turn this out, it screws up what I'm feeling, right? And he would say this all the time. And he's like, I'm not loving this. And I'm like, we're okay. Well, Rob, we just said nothing. We're just like, right? Because Rob's like, this is not working. And Rob is banging it out, right? Like Rob, as soon as we turn the system on, he's doing a great job. And when it's off, when he thinks he's in control and he's doing his stuff, he's terrible at the thing. And then we had another situation where this is Amanda, and I was going through putting the videos of this are painful to watch, right? Because we had worked with Amanda, we'd had blindfolds on, we didn't want her to see the hand, we didn't want to let her brain update or understand anything that we were doing. So for a week, she had no idea what we were doing. And then we, at the very end, on the last day before we put her on the plane, we said to Amanda, okay, hey, we're gonna take everything off, right? And we're gonna show you what we're doing. And so Amanda's sitting there and we take the blindfolds off and we're like, okay, hey, we got our cameras ready, right? And we're like, okay, what do you think? What do you think, right? And Amanda opens and closes the hand a couple of times and she's like, what? Right, like I could do this better with my blindfold on. And this is actually a screenshot out of that video. And so we're like, Amanda's like, yeah, I don't know, man. And so we just packed it all up and put her on the plane and left. And I remember just sitting in the room, we're like, holy crap. Like it doesn't, like nobody likes this. And it was this thing that it took years for us to get our head around this. And we actually had a grant that we put together. We're like trying to get around our head around perception. Kinesthesia is a sense most people don't know they have. And even now when we're doing media stuff and we're talking about the work that we do, people are like, yeah, we don't get this kinesthesia thing. Can you talk to us about touch? I'm like, yes, we've been doing touch for like 15 years. I don't want to talk about touch. I want to talk about kinesthesia because nobody's really doing that. And nobody can really engage with it. And the trick is we realized when they don't feel it, now that's when we've won, right? When they don't actually physically attend to what we're doing with them, when they're just like, oh, hey, I'm feeling the feels, I'm doing the things, I'm just doing it. It's like when they're not aware of the intervention, suddenly now we're in. Right. And that we would just put in a grant or the people we're working with, they were like, we want to talk about the perceptual mapping. And then we never talk about any of that, right? Because we want in and we don't want them to perceive it. Like we want it to be innate. And that's kind of where we're going to, I'm going to fast forward to, this is the video I told you about Rob. Rob's actually going to describe the difference between the self-referential I, which is the person that we talk to and have conversations with, that has opinions about the system, but then there's the system, and there's actually two people inside of you. There's the self-referential I, which is essentially your GUI, and then there's the system, which is essentially your operating system. And we can address each of those individually, and we, for all intents and purposes, do not care what the self-referential I has to say about it, right? What we're interested in is the system. And when we get into the system and then we provide the system with the information that it needs, suddenly now all sorts of cool stuff happens. So here's Rob talking about the self-referential I and the system in his own words, but it's uncanny with that. So I'll play this really quickly.
So for the most part, when you guys buzz my arm and the hand moves, that is almost the same as what I think when I go to close the hand. So if I have the arm on and I'm running things, that whole vibrator feedback, I don't notice it because I've already initiated that movement. I'm making it do that. So I don't really notice the vibration. Now, when I'm just sitting there not doing anything and you pull on the cord and it vibrates, in my head, it feels like I'm closing the hand. And if if I think about that too much while you're doing that, then I start closing the hand. And then I've initiated the action, and now it's not buzzing that's doing it, it's me now. So I've gotta be careful that when you say, okay, we're just gonna pull on the cord, and I've just gotta not think about it.
Right, and that thing, that I've just got to not think about it, right? And the neat thing about this is Rob's actually describing the sense of agency, right? And agency is tied to intent. And if you engage in an intentional action and then you get the appropriate feedback back, right? The emergent property of that is that you feel that you are the author of the action that you make. Most people, when they use a prosthesis, they lack that sense of agency. It is a thing. Right, and we do a lot of work in cooperative. We do a lot of work in human-machine cooperation in autonomous systems, right? And it's fascinating because your whole body is actually a series of interconnected autonomous systems that you are simply fooled into believing that you have control of because you have a sense of agency, because it gives you a feedback signal that matches to your intent. Right, and it's how your brain differentiates between your own movements and the movements of others and people around you and the things that you do. And it's the whole reason that you hate spell check on your computer, and that you hate anti-lock brakes in your car, and why people hate sensors, Autobox sensor speed hands, because they are things that have intent, that are moving and doing things that you did not tell them to do. And so what we do is we actually get in there and we hack that system, and then we provide you with a sense of agency over the autonomous function of the device. And that's like, as soon as we said, oh, we're not, this is a systems level conversation that we're having, then all sorts of cool stuff over there. And we're running tight on time, but so I'll just blast through these last little bits. But the proprioception is really interesting because it's good on its own. So all the stuff that I showed you previously is that it's good on its own, right? Like we can do some neat things. Proprioception has some functionality, but when we want to actually get at able-bodied levels of function, and the thing with the work that we do in the lab is that we're not interested in comparing against prosthesis users. Like we actually compare all of our stuff against able-bodied, and that was like we run when we built out. I'll talk about it in a sec, but we run everything against the gold standard of able-bodied, and we dig deeper into sort of innate behaviors, a lot of like that triggering the reflex, different things like that. And it's important because neural-machine interfaces and advanced bionics actually engage on a level that typical prosthetic limbs don't. And like that's kind of the thing that it prevents us from being able to get these implemented clinically, is this idea that, you know, the way that we evaluate the function of a bionic prosthesis is we use the same tests that we use that don't even do a great job of a standard prosthesis. And so nobody's going to pay for it. Nobody's going to engage with it. And patients aren't going to prescribe it because they're like, well, tell me that it's better, right? So that's kind of a sub-theme to all of this. But essentially what we do now is now we can start talking about this targeted sensory reinnervation of the muscle. We actually are reinnervating the proprioceptive sensory aspirates in the muscles themselves, and the vibrations actually what's triggering the sensation. It's muscular sensation, it's not skin sensation. And then when we put that over, recently we put all this together into fully bidirectional neural-machine interfaces that run touch, kinesthesia, and intentional motor control all simultaneously, all together. And so we just recently, put out a paper. We got the cover of Science Robotics, and it's just as a heads up to everybody, always take pictures of your stuff while you're doing things in the lab. And if you can pose things artfully and do some fun stuff with that, you can always have we keep a folder of imagery that we take during our experiments. And it turns out, it always has a great use because you can put it in figures, you can use it for cover suggestions, and it also really helps in your media packages because, everybody does all sorts of cool work across multiple things. So this Science Robotics paper that we published, where we were in a bit of a quandary, right? Because like I said earlier, it's being able to demonstrate to people that these devices are really functional. That's actually the intent of it, the clinical implementation. It's not the technology. The technology that you guys are exposed to every day, you've got some amazing stuff going on at JHU, right? Like it's not the mechatronics. right? It's not the sophistication of the control interfaces, it's not the sophistication of the machines that's keeping us. It's the fact that we can't go to an insurance company, a third-party payer, or a clinician and say, hey, our stuff works better than a body-powered prosthesis, because all of the metrics that we use to do that are essentially the metrics that a clinician, an occupational therapist, or a stopwatch makes a subjective decision about how well you're doing and times it with a stopwatch, right? And those are the measures that we compare all of these devices. And so me and my colleagues, John Sensing and Gaffron Hubert, we actually built out a functional metrics, a suite of functional metrics that actually get in and focus on the salient features of sensory motor dynamics, right? To say, hey, look, these are different than a body powered prosthesis. And so this paper that we put together is actually a metrics paper. And the only way that we got it into this journal was because we kind of pitched it as a bidirectional neural machine interface. But that wasn't actually the most, like, we were like, yeah, we do this all the time, we don't really care. It's the metrics that are the important piece, but nobody is going to publish those, right? And we, just so you guys know, if you have any sensory motor upper limb deficit, all of the metrics that we built are system agnostic. You can run anything against it, all the way from the most impaired to able-bodied for any sensory motor impairment. Doesn't matter what it is. You can run different prosthetic limbs, you can run stroke, you can run dystonia, you can do anything you want with it. And this paper is actually an instruction manual. So we put it all together in one cohesive package, and then the supplementary information provides you with all the mathematics that you need to run. So just a heads up on that. Yeah, so let's see here, where are we at? So we got like 10 minutes, right? Because we shut it down at the top of the hour, right? And we want to leave some time for questions. All right, so we got some tests. This is a test we work on. This is essentially a box squeezy test, and we did it so that it's clinically implementable. You just pour it out on the table, which is funny. So you pour it out on the table, and then we score it with a video, but we extract a whole lot of information out of each of the interactions that people have with blocks. And then, they're essentially just picking out they're picking five target blocks out of distractors, and then we can get a sense of how they're behaving. The reason I want to just show you here, so these are able-bodieds, right? And it looks like the profitability, right? Sufficiency and profitability. So it's like there's mathematics that you base all of the decisions you make on every day. And it's kind of cool. It's from evolutionary ecology, and it describes the feeding characteristics of praying mantises and seagulls and all these different animals. And we're bound by the same mathematics. And it really boils down to, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, how much effort do I have to put in for the payoff I'm going to get? You make all these decisions when you go out for coffee, when you do anything, when you're trying to acquire resources, you do this math in your head. And it's neat because from an efficiency and profitability perspective, these are body powered prosthetics. These blue triangles, they're actually pretty efficient, right? And this is, you see in the math right here, people will use the body-powered prosthesis because it's efficient. It's kissing in just at the bottom of the able-bodied population. And these are neural machine interface people. And even though touch is good, kinesthesia is food thing, but from a profitability perspective, it's still really hard to manage. But it's not the whole story. And this is a crazy complicated diagram. And so it essentially, it's a three-dimensional isomorphic projection into the corner of a triangle that takes like 7 different layers of data and compresses them all together. But the way it boils down is the graph from down at this corner out this way is how fast can you do the task, right? Like, and it's essentially doing that block sort of task. And then this corner out this way is how much time are you taking to make good decisions? Right, and then this from the bottom up to the top is like, how accurate are you at making these sort of decisions? And then, as I mentioned earlier, right, we run everybody against, we run body powers, we run, these are transradial myoelectrics, which are a super functional device. And then these are all able bodies. And an interesting thing about that is that now you can see why body power is not an awesome thing. Because each of these contour lines, right, is a reflection of your strategy. And you can be overly permissive or just not care about what you're doing and just do it as fast as you can, right, which is over here past this little cyan line. Or you can be overthinking every single decision that you make and just trying to figure out like, is this right? Is this right? Is this right? Is this right? And you can get stuck in this loop. Humans, us, able-bodied people, it turns out there's a mathematically defined balance point between trying to go as fast as you can and make a good decision, right? And we sort of fall along this line, this mathematically defined line, and at the very top of accuracy, you bias a little bit towards, I'm doing it okay, I'm going to go a little fast, right? But it turns out that this mathematically defined balance point, as soon as you turn on touch for these individuals, and this is Claudia, who's terrible at this task, she doesn't even know how to do the task, and she's just going as fast as she can to it. As soon as we give her touch, she goes right to the mathematically determined balance point. And then as soon as we give her kinesthesia, she actually biases up into the able-bodied population for the decisions that she's making. This is really just like, it's essentially, we're looking at the statistics between, did she grab the right block, or did she throw away the right block, or did she grab the wrong block, right? And those decisions that she's making in the sorting strategy are reflected in this whole graph. So what we find is as soon as we provide these appropriate levels of feedback, both kinesthesia and touch, both of our participants actually bias with able bodies. So we stratify with able bodies in the quality of the decisions that they're making. And they're not doing things 10 times over again, and they're not just going so fast that they just don't even bother, right? And these two edges of this equal compensatory injuries and sound side injuries. And this is the downfall of body poly processing. So let's see here. Let me just do 1 minute. So we also show the graph that I showed, the thing I showed you with Jacqueline's stuff. We use vision as kind of a proxy, to see where they're actually devoting cognitive information. And what we find is that as individuals use these systems, and these are really high level amputations, right? Claudia has a shoulder dysarticulation, and Rob has a high transhumeral amputation. These are really, really, really difficult amputations, and they're not very functional. And so these are people that are severely physically impaired. But when you look at the amount of time that they spend, as I mentioned earlier, right, instead of looking at their prosthesis and instead looking forward into the task, these graphs are a measure of how much forward they're looking into the task. And this is the able-bodied population right here. So Claudia actually starts heading down towards the able-bodied population. Rob's already pretty good, but Rob's actually getting cut pretty close to the average for the able-bodied population. And that's in reach and transport, that's grabbing a thing and then transporting it over a barrier. And then this one's really cool because Claudia, this is a really difficult task. She has to take a box and we've got it set up so that she grabs the box and then she has to turn and then put the box on a shelf above her eyes, right? So she actually has to reach up and put the box up. So she has to look away from the box. And what we find is that as Claudia actually starts heading towards the able-bodied population in this really hard turn and reach and look and actually have to divorce yourself entirely from watching. So let's see here. Yeah, so then, kind of the places that we're going now that we've got some head around like kinesthesia and how it's using it and what we're doing, we actually think that there's a kind of a different system going on from kinesthesia. It's not, they look at it not necessarily from the type 1 muscle spindle fibers. I mentioned earlier that some interesting stuff is happening. One of the things that's fascinating about this is that the signals that we're generating when we do our neural machine interface, we actually do them in the contracting muscle, right? So we get a sense of the movement of an actively contracting muscle. It's not what you would predict based on type 1 muscle spindle fibers, which is essentially 180 degrees split to that, because we assume that the muscle is being stretched, which provides you with the sensation of movement. We're working with a group out in Columbia. This is Yuri Denoy, and she's an expert in intersectional genetics and proprioception. And we had an interesting conversation with her because we were like, hey, so we've got this thing, and that was a lot of the work that we had done earlier with the brain mapping of animals. And so we think that we're kind of dealing with a different type of sensory receptor for kinesthesia. She's like, oh, that's crazy talk. And we said, well, we're seeing this different things in our physiology. We see these different things in our electrophysiology. Have you ever seen anything like this? And, to make this long story short, we were on the phone with her and we're like, hey, so if whatever we're thinking about is, if it looks like what I think it looks like little beads on the screen. Have you ever seen any of that in your histology? And she was like, no, I've never seen anything like that. And when we on the phone call, we're like, can you send us some histology? And so she starts sending us the histology. And we're like, well, what about that? And then we're like, well, what about that? Right? And she's like, well, that's just an artifact. We're like, and we're like, well, what about that? Right? Like every picture she shows us, these things pop up. And I'm like, they should be in between the muscle fibers. And if you look at this guy, there's actually these little guys are really vegetated in between the muscle fibers. And so we're recently awarded an IR1 to actually dig into this. And her thing was, since she does intersectional genetics, she's like, we have evidence for additional proprioceptive channels, but we just thought it was bad probes. And we're like, no, it's not bad probes. There's a thing in there. So we're doing calcium imaging and genetic ablation to take that apart with her. And then a lot of the kinesthesia stuff, now I'm working in the epilepsy center, and hacking into these systems gives us a lot of insight into how the brain's processing multisensory integration information. And so we've recently been working on actually kind of teasing that apart in stereoelectroencephalography in a way for epilepsy, and trying to figure out how the brain processes kinesthetic. So since I only left 2 minutes for questions, here we are.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions from those who are still around? Okay, well, I guess I have one, which, so I guess, what do you see as kind of, so you kind of outlined in the last slide, one kind of future direction, which is more on the side of finding these like low level explanations for the sensation that you're activating, right? Is that kind of how you would describe it?
So say that again.
So kind of the direction you outlined in the last couple of slides, or last slide, was kind of looking at the neuroscience kind of underlying this illusion and kind of the proprioceptive sensor exploring. On the clinical end, what is kind of the next thing that you feel is missing? You kind of talked about multimodality. I'm guessing you've already worked on that a little bit, but what exactly is the key piece for you there?
Well, I mean, we're kind of moving it in all sorts of different domains, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because we're not really focusing on prosthetics so much anymore. We're really curious about, and since we're being recorded, I can't dive into too deep on the stuff that we are doing in the future because there's a lot of IP and stuff wrapped up in it. But it's like we're really curious about actually using these sensations to provide meaningful information to people who are not, people who have other sensory motor deficits. Right? And then we think that there's some implications for this stuff in particular types of epilepsies, and so we're really digging in on that. It's not just we're not in the epilepsy center just to explore. We're actually working on some clinical approaches in that. But those, I can't dig in on the details of those, but so that's a terrible roundabout way of saying I can't really talk about the stuff that we're working on, but that's kind of like, we can't really talk about the stuff that we're working on too much.
No worries. Okay. Well, other questions, or are we good for now? All right. Well, thank you again for joining. Your story is always great, and we learn a lot, so I appreciate it. I've heard some of this before, and every time there's a lot to it. So every time I see something slightly different that I didn't notice the time before. So again, thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see you soon. All right. Let me